Shalom, it's Rabbi Josh Rose. I want to share some insights into the Torah portion. I hope what are some insights in Parshat Noach, the second Torah portion of the Torah in this new annual cycle of the reading. So Parshat Bereshit, the creation story, was last week, and this week we begin with the story of Noah and the flood, probably one of the most well-known stories in all of Western literature and probably in the Torah. Even people who don't know the Torah very well know the Torah story of Noah. At a minimum, they know about animals going into a large boat. But I want to get underneath the surface of the story and do so by going to the very end of last week's Torah portion, because I think to understand the moral significance of the Noah story, we have to understand a little bit about exactly what went so terribly wrong in creation and how does that link up to the flood. Why was it that God decided to bring a flood upon the earth? And one of the things that we see at the very beginning of chapter 6 in verse 2, which is still at the end of last week's Torah portion, we see rabbinic commentaries that talk about exactly what was going on in the earth in verse 2. And it brings there's a midrash that Rashi, our medieval commentator and our guide to the Torah text very often, there's a midrash that Rashi brings in which he says that the world had gone so crazy that when it refers to the Banot Adam, the daughters of Adam, Rashi says that what was happening is that the world had sort of lost all of its moral distinctions, and at least this is how I read it, because Rashi says even on the wedding night of a woman, she would have sexual relations with a man who was not her husband the evening before her wedding, or the evening of her wedding, excuse me. And so there was sort of a total moral carelessness and no distinctions between husband and other men, and spouse and people who were not the spouse. And then there's another midrash that on the same verse that talks about the fact that there was bestiality that had become kind of rampant, and human beings were having sexual relations with animals. And the reason that I think this is important is because I think that Rashi, through the midrashic tradition, is painting a portrait of a world in which the distinctions and moral distinctions have been completely erased. And according to the Jewish tradition, the erasing of moral distinctions goes against the very nature of creation. And the reason that I say that is because if we look back at the creation story, so at the very beginning of the Torah, what we see is that the creation is this profusion of delineations and distinctions. So one of the most important verbs in the creation story is lahavdil, to make a distinction. God creates a mavdil, a distinction, a boundary between light and dark, between land and sea, and that is how creation unfolds, by this increasing number of distinctions and boundaries. And that physical creation is mirrored in the moral universe. And right up until the time of the flood, what was happening is that human beings, according to the midrashic tradition, according to our commentaries, human beings were living in such moral chaos that those moral distinctions were no longer being seen as significant. And again, the example being that the man and woman were having sexual relations with whomever it was. It wasn't just spouses, and animals and human beings were having sexual relations as well. So there was kind of no distinction made. And here's how that links up to the flood story. When the flood takes place, God says that God wants to erase, is the way that we can translate the verb from the Hebrew. God wants to erase creation. And the commentators are quite specific, and Rashi is quite specific about this. Just as God made a distinction when God created human beings, so now is God going to bring so much water that all of those physical distinctions that are specific to creation, and that allow us to discern one part of the physical world from another part of the physical world, all of those boundaries will now be erased completely as the water comes in. So, for example, think of the human being. Human beings in the creation story are formed out of the dirt, and this sort of undifferentiated mass of mud and dirt God takes, shapes it and forms it into a distinct body, and then breathes life into it, so that what was once a mass of mud now becomes physically separate, a human being and human in shape, but also its consciousness is distinguished from the physical world around it. And so all of those aspects of creation that have to do with the profusion of distinctions and discernment, all of those things are now going to be erased in the physical world as God brings the flood, and as all of the physical world just dissolves in the flood. And so, just as human beings, according to the rabbinic interpretation, have erased moral distinctions and have introduced actions and behaviors and a kind of immorality and a kind of violence that shows that there's no moral distinctions, in the same way, God is now going to, almost in a sense, demonstrate the ultimate expression of that. Well, here's what will happen to the world if you do that. The world itself becomes uncreated and returns to this kind of primal state, this primeval state, in which there are no distinctions. There's no land, there's no water, there's no human being, there's just water. All except for one very important thing, and here's where I want to talk about the moral power of human beings. And we look at the very, very first verse of our Torah portion, of Parshat Noach, the Torah portion of Noah, which begins at chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 9. The Torah says, Ele toldot Noach ish tzadik tamim bedorotav. And it's a strange statement because it says, that could be translated as, these are the generations of Noah. At which point we would normally expect a genealogy to take place. Usually when it says, these are the generations of Avram, we would then expect all of the genealogy and who begot whom and whose father was who and whose mother was whom. But here we get, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a ish tzaddik tamim, a perfectly righteous person, bedorotav, in his generation. And one of the very important comments that Rashi makes, Rashi says, this teaches us that the essential generative power, the essential genealogy, so to speak, of a righteous person are the good deeds that they do. The essential genealogy that a righteous person creates has to do with their good deeds. That is, what's significant is not who we bring into the world. It's not our physical actions in the world. It's what kind of world we create, what sort of acts we do. Those are really, so to speak, our children. Those are our generations, the good acts we do. So if we look at the moral chaos that we talk about at the end of the previous Torah portion as a destruction of creation, we then see this in this little midrashic comment, a suggestion that the creative power of human beings, what allows us to create generations, so to speak, are our moral actions. And I'll just close with a very well-known teaching by Rashi. Rashi brings two possible ways to read the odd qualification about Noah's moral strength, because the Torah says he was a righteous person in his generation. And Rashi says we can read this either as a praise of him, which is to say that even in a generation that was so messed up and so craven and so morally chaotic and indifferent and cruel, even when he was surrounded by those kinds of awful people, he didn't lose his moral core. Noah didn't. And so even in his generation, he maintained his righteousness. He didn't allow himself to get, so to speak, watered down morally. He maintained his moral core and was not influenced by the bad forces around him. Or, Rashi says, we can read it in the opposite way, as a kind of implicit diminution of his praise or a criticism of Noah, by saying, sure, in his generation he was a righteous person, but if you compared him to somebody like Abraham in Abraham's generation, he would have been nothing. And so we have to sort of look at Noah with suspicion according to these dual interpretations. But for me, what's significant about that is merely to look at the reality that the Midrash points to, which is that we are so deeply affected by the moral expectations and the moral behavior of the generation that surrounds us, and that our moral goal, our spiritual aspiration, should be not to measure ourselves compared to in comparison to what we can get away with or what's acceptable in our generation, but rather to aspire to a kind of absolute goodness, and that when we seek to be creative forces for good in the world, and when we create when we strive to create, so to speak, the children, that is, the beautiful acts of goodness and righteousness in our lives, that we should be not looking over our shoulder about what other people are doing or what we should get away with, what we could get away with, but rather we should be aspiring to create something good and beautiful in an eternal and absolute sense. Thank you. Hope it's been useful and a good insight into the Torah portion, and I'll see you soon.